Okay, many thanks to our panelists. We're now splitting into two tracks. If you're interested in Japan, please go to the Harbourview Ballroom on level 4. For those of you who want to stay here, we're now looking at private debt, if our panelists would like to come up. Our moderator is Heinz Blennerman, principal with Blennerman Family Investments. And with him we have Tony Liu of Shoreline Capital, Barnaby Lyons of Bain Capital Credit Asia, Hasib Malik of Vade Partners, and William Sanderson of EIG. Are you starting here? Okay.
Thanks, everyone, for coming to the session. So most of the sessions here were on private equity, so we're going to change our focus now to private debt. It's one of my favorite areas to invest because I just believe that the risk-return profile is very attractive. But what's interesting about the panel today is kind of talking about what the impact is of investing in Asia versus in other parts of the world, because private debt does have a little different flavor here, as we'll hear today. And so hopefully that'll be one of the takeaways here, is how is private debt here in Asia different than in the rest of the world? So I'm a single-family office based in California, and I spend quite a bit of time in private debt. And I like the space because of the relative downside protection that you can get. And so one of the things that we'll talk about today is what sort of collateral can you get here? Will the regulations in the different countries allow the seizure of collateral? We'll talk about multiple strategies ranging from distressed to not distressed, and talk about some folks. One of our panelists actually focuses exclusively on energy debt, so it's going to be an interesting discussion here. So with that, perhaps on the first go-around here, we can introduce ourselves, and if you could please also state, if you're in a multi-strategy environment, if you can tell us what your favorite strategy is. To start with, Tony. Tony Liu here is the Chief Operating Officer at Shoreline Capital, an NPL strategy. But Tony, you want to kick this off and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I'm Tony Liu. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Shoreline Capital. And Shoreline is focused on investment on NPL, non-performing loans, and distressed assets in China. And Shoreline has been in the market for over 10 years, since the early 2000s. And our strategy in the moment is still focused on the investment on the NPL still, especially in the next 2 to 3 years, because we thought that in the next 2 or 3 years will be the golden stage to do the NPL in China. Because if you look at the recent regulation release in China in August, and there's a release from the central government saying that the banks are allowed to do debt to equity swaps. And in the recent October, which is last month, I think there's another regulation released by the government saying that each province is allowed to set up another, which is the second local AMC. And I think the message sent from the government is that I think the banks are suffering tremendous pressure from the NPL. So we think that is in the next 2 or 3 years, maybe the golden time to invest in NPL, and we still keep doing that. So that's for me.
And then just geographically speaking, you focus exclusively on China, and first-tier cities, second-tier cities, or is it pan-China?
Yeah. First of all, I think our strategy at the moment mainly focus on China. And in terms of geographic, because China is so huge, so if you look at NPL, it's not only the pricing, but also you need a sense of the local liquidity of the different market among China. So at the moment, we only focus on the eastern side of China, which believe in terms of economics, in terms of the legal environment, will be much better than the western side of the China. So go back to your question, yes, in China, and at the moment we focus on the eastern of China, but in the next year, maybe actually we are doing some explorations in the western South China as well. Recently, we bought a small NPL in Sichuan, Chengdu. It's a very small size, but we want to use it as first of our sort of adventure to see how the local markets are and the legal environment are. So that is some sort of testing we have been doing. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Hasib. So Hasib Malik is a senior managing director at Varde Partners. And it's interesting, their approach is a little bit different in that they actually put together platforms, if I understand this correctly, where you have platform companies that have direct lending and other types of lending strategies, sort of using them as a wrapper. But love to hear more.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's one of our strategies, certainly. Varde, just to give everyone a little bit of an overview, is a $12 billion AUM fund based out of Minneapolis in the US. We've been in business since '93, have 12 offices globally, 4 in Asia, with Singapore, Japan, Sydney, as well as Hong Kong now. And our strategies fall in 3 basic segments, I would say. Number 1 is corporate credit, which we've sort of done globally since our founding in '93, as well as real estate as the second bucket. And the third bucket is what we call private equity, but the private equity is within sort of credit-based platforms. And so we call it the specialty finance bucket. Within corporate credit, I think it's a pretty interesting market for us. We do both primary and secondary. In secondary, our roots are in distressed, which we've done since our founding. And so we take, in Asia, we see a really large portion of both commodity and commodity linked as a theme within corporate credit, which is in the secondary where banks are pulling back, want to sell their exposures, want to get out of commodity themes. As well as I think on the primary, we see a fair bit of what we call either direct lending or special sits lending as an opportunity set in Asia today. I think that's a pretty broad business. We're focused on a few markets, including Australia, Indonesia, and to some extent India, as we start to look at these markets. And so that's sort of the basic theme of private debt. And for a long time, we've had a history of NPL transactions. We've really focused on both real estate-based NPLs, both in Europe, US, and now also Asia, as well as other NPLs sort of in the corporate space. So thematically, that's sort of our broad breadth as a platform.
Yeah. And what will be interesting to hear later on, sort of those 3, which one is currently your favorite? And because, by the way, you don't break them apart, right? You have one large fund, and you have all the strategies in there, so it's a multi-strat type of fund. But yeah, maybe if you can just say a word about, of those 3 areas, where are you spending your most time right now?
So I'm spending, not by design, but I spend most of the time in the corporate sort of space, both within the secondaries in Asia, where I'm spending a fair bit of time, half and half, and also on the primary lending within corporates. That having been said, of course, the platform has a broad breadth. And so I don't think there's a favorite, and it also depends on markets. You know, you sort of see back in February, when markets were really wide in terms of credit spreads, we saw the traded part of our business being really the main focus. And as we move away from it, it's certainly more on the illiquid side today that I see a little more value. But that having been said, it's always pretty even for us.
Okay. Barnaby. Barnaby Lyons is Managing Director, Head of Asia, with Bain Capital. And what's interesting about his strategy as well is you cover multiple strategies as well, like Hasib, and maybe you can contrast what areas you're in that he's not in, and just to get a little contrast
Sure.
here.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Bain Capital, as many of you will know, is a large alternative asset manager. We manage about $80 billion. And within that, the credit business is $30 billion of that. And as Heinz rightly points out, we have a broad set of strategies ranging from liquid credit at the more performing and safest end through to more distressed and special situations investments at the riskier end. And we offer a range of products to LPs across all of those. In Asia, our focus, Asia and Australia, our focus is largely on our special situations strategy, where really there are three key themes we follow. We buy from banks, we replace banks, and we clean up their excesses in the form of distressed investing. So in buying from banks, we've seen consistent non-core disposals from global banks as they exit the region or exit certain business lines, and indeed also rising NPL levels across the region. And pretty complicated, high barrier to entry opportunity set, but one where there's a forced seller often and really interesting value to be got. Second strategy is capital solutions, where we provide bespoke solutions for corporates that can't access traditional forms of capital, whether it's the equity markets are closed to them, whether private equity is too dilutive, or whether banks, for some reason, regulatory or other reasons, may not lend to them. We try and provide solutions that solve their problems. And the third one would be distressed investing, which is more episodic and is more related to particular segments or industries that might be out of favor. Commodities, for example, is throwing up a lot of opportunities. You need to be selective, but there are interesting opportunities. If I compare us and Varde, it's a hard thing to do because a lot of what we do overlaps. But as a general point, the good news is in Asia Pacific, certainly there's really quite few people doing this. So while we do bump into Varde every so often on transactions, it's not that frequent.
But probably not on the real estate side. So that's only
real estate is certainly a part of our strategy.
Is as well.
Normally as part of one of those three verticals, rather than as direct private equity ownership.
But in terms of the size of the deals, you look at some similar deal sizes. Yes. Okay, thank you. And then coming from two generalists, we're now going to focus on a specialist who only looks at the energy markets, but energy markets globally. So William Sonneborn is president of EIG and flew in from Washington, D.C., but I think you're here in this area quite a bit. But could you give us a little overview? Why energy,
Sure.
energy debt?
Thanks, Heinz. Well, the area of energy we focus on, which is really the full value chain, so everything from upstream through power and renewables, pipelines, transportation, transmission in between, is about 35% of global GDP. It's about 55% of global capital expenditures. And the biggest need for it is in this region, in the context of both importing raw materials for purposes of producing it and the growth generally in power generation over the course of the next decade or two. And it's also an industry that's going through a massive transformation, not only because of the commodity price cycle that we've gone through, but also the substitution power of renewables. And so understanding that full specter and thinking about where in the capital structure to invest is really what we've done for 34 years. We're investing our 16th kind of flagship fund that goes up and down capital structures globally. We've invested in 36 countries through that strategy. And we're raising our fourth fund focused on direct lending globally on energy and related infrastructure.
And we talked about this a little bit earlier before the panel. There's not that much energy production here in Asia, but Asia is a huge consumer. And so sort of the things you invest in here in Asia are more the distribution, the servicing, but maybe you can elaborate.
We've done a lot in Asia in power. So renewables in India has been a core focus because renewables are at power parity, given India has to both import coal or natural gas for electricity. So you don't need subsidies to drive your returns. They're at power parity. And we've been investing in 20 years in Australia, which is a huge source of energy that ultimately is getting exported up into this part of the world.
Thank you. So the next round of questions is going to be on sort of geography. Opportunity here versus opportunity elsewhere, and how does that compare in the returns that you get here? Because as investors, we're all interested in how good are the returns here in Asia, and what's the competitive landscape look like? Tony, do you want to maybe kick this off? And why do you do NPLs in China? Although I kind of have a good idea where this is going, but also in terms of barriers to entry, licenses, and you mentioned licenses a little bit earlier, but what sort of barriers to entry if there's a multinational that came in from a large fund came in from the US to enter your space, what sort of barriers would they have? What advantages do you have?
Yeah, actually, I think that my personal view is that because obviously there's a lot of foreign investors right now is very interested in doing business in NPL in China. So, I think one of the things that they might ignore is that the infrastructure in place. That is the number one priority, and I think that is something that Shoreline has built for years. So, so-called infrastructure is a network of local services to help you to manage your portfolio, NPL portfolio, on a day-to-day basis. Because I have been in the growth stage investment firm before. I think the management, the post-deal management of your portfolio is a total different story between a PE or an NPL credit style of investment. So the difference is between, like, if you bought an NPL from a bank, so you have to deal with the local banks, the local debtors, and the local courts on a day-to-day basis, which means it's a more labor-intensive work compared to your PE type of investment. So you have two options. Either you do it by yourself, you engage 200 people across the country, or you identify and partner with some local services. So-called those services are someone who may be in ex-AMC people, or a good lawyer in non-performing loans, or they come from the banks. So we basically set up a network across the country to help us do this. So that is the second option. I mean, we choose to partner with the local people to help us to do the work. And right now, Shoreline has nearly 50 services, and we want to expand to 70 or 80. And in addition to the numbers, we also do something like want to escalate this network to another level, which means I not only doing a single project business with you, but also we sign a framework agreement. We want to, utilize this network not only on NPL, maybe in the later stage to do distressed, and helping other market players to resolve the NPL as well. And our framework agreement is like the key terms like the key man, or we got the Roland in their companies and things like that. We want to bond all these guys together, and we want to align our interest. And so it's not only a single project, but also want to escalate the whole network into another level. So go back to your question, why the entry barrier is high, relatively high compared to other PE or VC type of investment, is you have to have a national network if you want to do an NPL in China. That is, I think, the most important thing.
And just a quick question. So if you choose the wrong servicer, what can go wrong?
A lot of things can go wrong. So, so the number one priority is we choose a servicer is integrity. Having said, Heinz, you have been in local for 20 years or in the bank, but that is only one of the factors we consider. The most important factor is the integrity, because Shoreline, as I said, has been in the market in China for over 10 years. One of the strengths and key competence we have is we know all the people across the country. And you specialize in Shanghai, maybe Hansi specialize in Guangdong, Babani in northern country. We know you all because we're in the market for 10 years. And we can easily identify someone locally. Even before we buy an NPL in a specific province, the first thing we want to do is identify the servicer. So,
thank you. Yeah, so it's about relationships.
Yeah.
Hasib, can you talk a little bit about, since your company, based in beautiful Minnesota, has a global reach, you've seen, what the Asian performance is relative to the worldwide performance. How do you see yourself as in terms of returns and collateral? How do you see the Asia operations?
For us, within the segments we talked about going back, I think within the distressed market that we're looking at, Australia certainly is a developed market. So we generally, within Asia, will say, okay, in developed markets, it's pretty similar to the US in terms of the distressed opportunities. I think we're on the ground for a long time in Australia now, 8 years of experience there. So we get to see the opportunities, and I think there is a little bit of a lag in terms of returns between sort of global investors and that. So you can have some timing difference in terms of where you can create the right restructuring expertise in the debt, as well as go in and really buy the debt a little bit cheaper sometimes, but it's pretty similar in terms of returns overall as we think about that. I think in some of the other geographies where, again, everything is very relationship-based and a lot more local within private lending, we do find that there is still a premium to be had if you spend the time. Bardet has 23 years of history in terms of certain sectors, and so things that we are very comfortable in as from an asset class standpoint or an industry standpoint, we try to put those risks on within Asia, and I think we can get good collateral cover in some of these things because banks aren't willing to lend. So one of the themes that Barnaby talked about is also very important to us. We call it bank retrenchment, where either banks are retrenching from the region and don't want to be here, European banks or things don't have a reason to exist, or Australian banks pulling bank from Asia, you see a lack of lending sometimes. So I think it's liquidity driven and very liquidity specific. We do find that we can put out risks today and a couple of things in the pipeline in, say, the commodity space, where on a very relative value basis, there is a couple of 100 points of return that we think is extra for us for the same similar type of risk. And we have global teams, so we can talk to our copper expert in Europe who's looking at a lot of big capital structures, can figure out what the liquidity premium is as well as what the premium we're getting in Asian markets. But it comes down to relationships, to Tony's point. I think if we have the right relationships in some of these geographies, we can create the risk better, we feel, as we compare across our platform in Asia.
But just a point on the compensation. You do get compensated for coming here to Asia, right?
Correct.
Maybe 1 or 2 points on real estate debt, or if you compare apples to apples with corporate debt, right? To compensate for the currency, for maybe some of the country risk, for some of the collateral and regulation risk. Is that what you see too? It's 2
look,
points, something along those lines?
Well, I wouldn't
it's hard to pin
bucket
you
it.
down on number, but
Yeah, it's hard to
but
pin
it's
down on a
couple
number.
points.
But it is for sure true that we, in some cases, find it. I think you have to go looking for it. And that comes to the relationships in the region. And I think it comes down to how you can effectively work with companies as partnerships to lend to them. I think the lending is about, as the economy slows here to some extent, you can actually have a path to a high yield offering for some of these companies. And they're sort of in the $300 to $700 million EV range and create that risk for yourself. Or sometimes it's also flexibility of capital for us. We are more flexible in terms of the time it takes to get our diligence done because of our global relative value than some of the banks. So we're competing with the banks in a lot of ways, but I think we're providing a solution from a capital standpoint.
So Barnaby, thank you. Barnaby, you deal in multiple strategies, direct lending, special sits. What I find interesting too is oftentimes there's this migration of strategies. Like a lot of the trade finance strategies started in Switzerland and then came to the U.S. and then also came to Asia. But in terms of strategies, since you see these multiple strategies in the U.S. as well as here in Asia, do you see that Asia is that there's some strategies here in Asia that haven't come over to the continent yet? Some of the more special. Or do you see pretty much the same set of strategies being used in the U.S. as here in Asia?
Look, I think the sophistication and depth of the Asian credit markets are clearly behind the U.S. and behind Europe and behind further the U.S. Frankly, for investors like like us, it creates opportunities because right now, for example, the rate environment in Europe and North America mean that our distressed business is pretty quiet, actually. There's an NPL opportunity in Europe, which is extremely active, but corporate distress had a window of opportunity around energy in the US over the last 12 months. But at the moment, a lot of companies can find solutions away from the higher cost of capital that we would provide. So in Asia, however, if I think about where we are in the cycle now, after what has been the largest explosion of credit the world has ever seen over the last 8 years in Asia, In China alone, you look at a 4 to 5 times increase in their loan book in that period. You're seeing that slow down, and you're seeing the fact that a lot of that credit was allocated inefficiently or to the wrong place, and because of that, banks are retrenching, to repeat the theme, and there becomes an opportunity for us to fill that gap. In the US, it might get solved by high yield. It might get solved by the CLO market. Here, a lot of those opportunities are created because the market is less sophisticated.
Got it. So here, you don't have as much of a collateralized CDO market. Here, there's more whole loans.
There's no CLO or CDO market, for example. Whereas that might represent 30-40% of the loan issuance in Europe, for example.
And that could also present an opportunity that things aren't at the same stage as they are elsewhere. It's very interesting.
And one thing to pick up on, as I think about what's changed in this market from a competitive standpoint, 10 years ago, you would have had all of the major investment banks with active proprietary groups investing in private credit broadly in this market, many of them multi-billion-dollar businesses. Today, really, Goldman to some degree, Credit Suisse to some degree, and beyond that, they may say they do, but most of them has retrenched enormously or liquidated like Lehman. So that has also opened up a pretty interesting opportunity for a whole range of strategies, because they used to really be that non-traditional lender of, not last resort, but the alternative form of capital, and they've gone.
Lots of opportunity from that angle. Thank you. Bill, love to sort of hear what your thoughts are on the Asia opportunity, and also maybe if you can also address because you do more project finance than corporate finance, and so in terms of assets, do you feel the assets here are, what kind of issues do you have here versus other parts of the world where the regulations are different?
There's a broad number of issues in Asia and how we think about that relative to risk premium and returns necessary for Asia. But if you think about project finance, given that we're asset-based lenders, we really like to have security collateral on an asset. That could be a power plant, that could be a pipeline, that could be reserves underground of oil and gas. The global competition that we really face are banks. Almost all project finance sits historically on banks that lie within Europe that are generating a lot of MPLs that Barnaby's colleagues are buying, or in Japan, which is the second largest set of banks that do project finance, who are suffering from a rising yen and their own problems. And so that creates a big vacuum in the context of capital globally, and certainly in Asia. Albeit in Asia, we're hesitant in most cases to rely upon our security collateral and underlying assets for two reasons. One, it's dominated by state-owned entities, so national champions, which by its nature means that you're not necessarily dealing with a business and their assets. You're dealing ultimately with the government of each country. And so that creates its own challenges. And so in the region, we tend to do more structured equity, moving into preferreds, where we have seniority, we have preference, but we aren't going to take share pledges as our collateral, which effectively is turning equity risk into a credit interest rate. We really would move down more into preferred and then start to look at equity-like rates of return.
And these assets don't necessarily have to be offshore, is that right?
They don't, no. We're onshore in India, for example, financing hydro, wind, and solar power plants all across the country.
So you understand the regulations there.
We're going in through Mauritius for security purposes, but that gives you an idea.
Thank you. This next go-around of questions, we're going to talk a little bit more about the risks in each of the strategies. Understanding that the risks in private debt are substantially less than in private equity. The returns might not be as high, but the risks are fewer in private debt. But that said, there are risks, and it might be great just to get your perspectives on the risk side and what you do about them. And with that, maybe Tony, you can kick it off a little bit. And one of the things that in your space that maybe you could talk a little bit about is how do you exit your positions? Because NPLs, it's not a direct lending strategy where you automatically get paid at the end unless you do a buy and hold, but maybe you can talk about where whether if that's a strategy that you do or whether you sell early. But what is sort of the risk as well in exiting a position?
Yeah, sure. And because it's interesting for outsiders to perceive debt collection company. So I still remember that I shortly after I joined Shortline, one of the night I have a dinner with my father, and my father know I joined a company collecting debt in China. So he told me seriously, saying, "Be careful, son." So, but it's a very mature model actually in China. So we categorize the exit into 3 different, we call it traditional approach. And the first one is simply after we bought the portfolio, the first exit route is to resell to third party, sell the debt to third parties, and that probably accounts for 50% of our exit route. And because there are a niche market players in China that they very interested and they know the NPL. Maybe they are the customers or supplier of the original debtors, and they might be interested in the collaterals of that specific loan itself. So this go back to the point that we need a network of reservicer. One of their job or role is to help us to identify the potential buyer for some of the assets. So that is one of our exit. And the second one is we exit to the buyback from the borrower, original borrower. These account for 30% of our exit. Because in China, that's if you want a bank to waive the interest or reduce the principal with the original borrower, basically almost impossible because a lot of reasons. First thing, I think, is the ethical reasons. Because if I'm sitting in a bank that owned by the government, it's very difficult to argue why I want to waive. Heinz, you owe me $1, and why I need to waive your interest rate. So in addition to the ethical reasons, there are a number of internal approval process reasons involved. So it's very difficult for the bank to do so. But after they transfer the whole portfolio to someone like Shortline, we allow to do so. So I think this is the quickest way, especially in the first or 2 years when we bought the portfolio, is the quickest way we get the cash back is to approach the original debtors and ask them, well, we negotiate price and you can buy your loan back. So that is the second approach. And the third is easy to understand, is to, through legal proceeding, ask for auction for the collateral and things like that. That accounts for 20% of our exit. So these are the 3 traditional exit approaches.
And of these exit approaches, I know you work closely together with the services. Is there sometimes a conflict of interest that the servicer would like to get rid of a loan a little faster than you would? And then how do you resolve that?
Yeah, so one of our main goals is to, our job is to make sure that the servicer, to maintain a service network and to make sure they do their jobs properly. There's a number of things involved. I go back to your question. First thing is you need to design a mechanism between all the different services. Mechanism include the compensation plan, the economic of sharing with the services, and how to, monitor with them. I mean, our investment team will have at least a weekly call and go to know the collateral on site. And we have a business plan in place. That business plan is our sort of the target return for the whole portfolio. That is something we hold on hand. And this is the base that, say, for example, if the servicer want to get rid of it as quick as possible, regardless the IRR or multiple, we got a plan because they have to go through our approval process so then they can, sell the assets out.
Got it. So it's contractually already predetermined
Yeah, contractually,
what the exits are. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Hasib, Can you talk a little bit about, I know you have multiple strategies, but maybe you could choose one of your 3 strategies. What keeps you up at night? What could go wrong, and how do you protect against that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I think the biggest fundamental risk that we worry about sometimes, or most of the time, is that you're stuck into equity-like risk, but getting debt-like returns. So I think that's the risk you have to mitigate as you get into some of the private debt structures and when you're investing. And that's mitigated in a number of ways. One is your just experience set globally in the asset class. Number 2, knowing that there's good equity value below you, and it will continue to grow by your diligence with your teams on the ground. And I think it's mitigated through sort of having actually local people on your own staff that has spent time with the company and also spent time understanding the asset itself. And over time, I think it's a relationship business at the end of the day, and we have to have the people actually working with the company. It's not like you make the loan or you buy the debt of it and then forget about it. I think proactively working with all the stakeholders within the whole complex and actually mitigating that risk to understand it through the journey of the investment is, I think that's the way you sort of get away from a lot of the fundamental risks, as well as where there's problems of collateral and having direct access to collateral. That's really important for us.
Is taxation one of the risks? I know, because you invest in India as well? Is that so? There's a withholding tax there, but
across the region, we have global tax experts who look at our tax platforms across the globe. And yes, that's one of the parts. Before we invest, we have to be proactive in understanding the tax risk, both from a regulatory standpoint, but on the deal itself. And
so you bake that in. Mm-hmm.
We bake that in, and we take that into account before we make the investment.
Thank you. Barnaby, love to hear your thoughts on sort of what risks you see in your portfoldio. Is it currency or other types of risks, and what's the main one that keeps you up?
There's the obvious macro issues, the direction of China, the direction of the US with recent events, and of course currency volatility is something that we also manage carefully. We hedge almost all of our investments. And price that cost in as we underwrite, and really think about whether that net US dollar return makes sense rather than taking currency risk. So there's that bucket of risks that are just core to every investment we make across Bain Capital. Then there are, of course, much more micro risks that relate to the specific company, the specific asset that we're investing in, or the specific situation. I think the approach we take is as much as possible to be a solutions provider, because when you're providing a solution, you're typically building alignment with the underlying company or sponsor. And you also, as you're solving his or her needs, you can also find creative ways to protect yourself, be it incremental forms of security that are not part of the existing group that you're looking at, whether it's ways to have a hook on that person individually to kind of ensure good behavior through restructurings. But ultimately, some of these structures don't make sense. And the most important risk mitigant is discipline in your investing mandate, and knowing when actually it doesn't make sense to pursue a particular deal.
I've once heard from somebody, it's not necessarily the value of the collateral, but it's the emotional content to the person who's making the loan.
We care about the value as well. Just to be clear.
But of these two, because you mentioned both the macro and the micro, that there are risks in both of them. The macro and what's the whole economy look like, and the micro, how do we execute this one specific deal? Of the two, is one something that you worry more about? Because I would think it's more the micro, right? The bottoms up.
Macro, of course, is important for all of us in this room. We spend most time designing, I guess, micro structures that insulate us, because after all, we're taking the credit risk in a structure, not the equity risk, that insulate us from the volatility that might be going on from a macro perspective. So whether it's a structured mezzanine loan with warrants, we might be 40% to 70% of the way through a company's enterprise value. And we may have a bunch of triggers that would allow us to step in and mitigate risk should that business underperform because of the macro environment. So, of course, it's important, but it's a second-order priority to getting the structure right, understanding the business and its cash flows.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So it's interesting, the two speakers right now were more generalists, and so they can kind of spread their risks across the whole portfolio. But Bill, you're very focused just on energy and was wondering, what sort of exposure do you have to energy prices, and how has that affected you in the last 2 years?
It's a good question, Heinz, because the first thing when people think about energy lending is, oh my gosh, you're exposed to commodity prices. That's relevant, but the most important risk, if we go back and we look at 34 years of history, and we look at the mistakes we've made over 34 years, it's not because we invested when oil price was 100 and then it dropped to 40. It's we missed technically the asset. The key thing that is really, really important when you're thinking about the global energy value chain is having a deep technical bench. We have 14 engineers on staff, proprietary database. You need to be focused on top quality, whether it's a power plant in terms of its dispatch curve, when it dispatches in terms of providing power. If it's oil and gas, it's in the cost and productivity of the underlying reservoir. If you get that right, even in bad environments, you end up with recovery rate way ahead of your original par on your loan, way ahead. So in the context of what we do as a team, technical expertise is the absolute critical thing that we got to get right.
So commodity prices really didn't have much of an impact in the returns of the funds.
Virtually none.
Really
over
interesting.
34 years.
And that's probably misunderstood. Yeah, that's interesting. So,
so can I add a few more points on the risks? Because I think it's worth mentioning another point. In addition to the structure and tax we already mentioned, and because the recent tightening of foreign exchange control in China, so I think one of the important issue is the repatriation, because that I think not only impacts debt investors, but also every foreign investors investing into China. So especially for NPL, we get the collections in renminbi local currency on a day-to-day basis. So if you cannot manage the repatriation well, it can easily destroy your return. So we have been spending the last couple of months to study and find out a sort of a solution or approach to do it, because it just, from our day-to-day experience, it just very difficult. So I just want to raise this point, the repatriation structure and the tax, because the tax in, especially in China NPL, the regulation is unclear. It used to be a specific tax regulation in terms of how to tax your profits on NPL, but that regulation has been expired, and there's no latest one issue. So it just been careful. I mean, in terms of tax, it's still unclear in terms of if you make a profit on NPL, how to pay the tax and how to repatriate.
Great question. Yeah, the whole repatriation issue is interesting, but it works both ways. You know, if there are problems repatriating things to the U.S. might retaliate, and hopefully things never go that place. So we have time for one question here. Who would like to ask a question about private debt and how attractive or what some of the risks are? Or anyone here would like to ask something about private debt? Going once? Twice? Okay. I'll ask maybe. So each of you has funds. Maybe could one of you talk about what would happen if you doubled the size of your fund? Would you still, so say you're raising a $1 billion fund. If you raised a $2 billion fund, what brick wall would you hit? So are there capacity constraints to your strategy? And maybe if we could have one person answer this, because unfortunately we don't have that much time. One of you would like to take this as a...
I think it depends, right? So we have two main strategies. I think our more mezzanine structured equity strategy, we've looked back, it benefits from larger transactions, less competition globally, able to be a one-stop shop and solution. The energy business is highly capital intensive. What used to cost $1 million to drill now costs $300 million to drill. In direct lending, I think it's the opposite. I think in direct lending, size is your enemy because you start to compete with capital market solutions.
Yeah, because it's interesting. So you have a CalPERS with $300 billion, and the whole private credit market worldwide, depending on how you define it, might be, I've heard from Preqin, is around $100 billion is the fundraise every year. So there's capacity issues. And so these are attractive, all of these are various attractive strategies, but there's only so much capacity to go around. I hope you enjoyed this panel, kind of hearing from our 4 experts, 2 generalists and 2 specialists of how to invest here in Asian private equity, private debt rather. And it has, you might not get the huge pops, but there's definitely a lot more downside protection. And with that, if you can please help me thank the speakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.